Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to jump right into today's webinar on turning climate adaptation plans into projects. I will be your host for today. My name is Bo Shane. I am a project officer with the Green Municipal Fund, and I am joined by my teammates Emma Kirk and Mohammed Shami working on the production side of things. We are thrilled to have a fantastic panel of speakers sharing their insights today. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the lands upon which I live, work, and play have served and continue to serve as traditional lands for many people over time, including the Attawandarok and the Haudenosaunee. This land is Treaty 3 lands, also known as the Between the Lakes Treaty, held with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I would like to take this moment to reflect on an upcoming date. And that date is this coming Monday, December 15th, which will mark 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report was released. So 10 years after the release of the TRC report, we do have a long way to go. So I would like to share a report that offers some hope and some of the progress that has been made. This report was released last week by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and this center was formed to continue the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I encourage you to explore that report. And I'm going to just ask my teammate Emma to post the link to the report in the chat, just because I'm having a little bit of a funny thing happening on my screens. Thank you. And also for the next slide, please. So today's webinar is part of a broader webinar series hosted by the Green Municipal Fund, GMF. GMF is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities' largest program, and it offers a unique combination of funding paired with capacity building, things like training and peer learning opportunities and other learning opportunities like this webinar. And at the end of today's webinar, we will be sharing some links and ways to get in touch with us to learn more about our funding and capacity building opportunities. Next slide, please. So the smiling faces you see on your screen are our wonderful guests for today. We have Eva Jackson, Managing Director of ICLEI Canada, who is here to share and spotlight some fantastic resources with us. Additionally, we have several panelists here. Derry Wallace, a climate change and energy specialist with the County of Huron. Sean Dias, Deputy City Manager with the City of Morden in Manitoba, and Rachel Mitchell, Director of Community Climate Initiatives with the Clean Foundation. So Derry, Sean, and Rachel will each be sharing insights as part of a panel discussion. And that panel discussion will focus not only on the challenges faced by municipalities in moving from planning to action, but also dive in and explore the opportunities that climate change and climate adaptation work poses to support project prioritization for municipalities. And to kick things off, we are going to start with one of those quick resource spotlights that I mentioned. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. This first resource we'll be sharing is a GMF resource titled Adaptation Actions to Implement Climate Resilience. Emma, could you post the link to the resource in the chat, please? Thank you. So this resource is a simple, easy to use, easy to navigate resource. You'll see the QR code up in the corner. I'll encourage you to click on that or use your phone to scan it or click on the link that Emma is posting in the chat. And the reason that I'm encouraging you to take a peek at the resource before I dive into the details is because this resource is really quite simple to navigate and digest. Once opened, if you scroll past the introduction, you'll see a little accordion that matches the box on the right of the screen. And if you click on the little pluses, just like an accordion, you'll see it pop open. And when it pops open, you'll see a short list of adaptation actions under that heading. You can close that up and pop open another one. So if you've taken a moment to take a look, I am going to draw your attention back up here to focus on me. because one great way to think about this resource would be to view it as a menu, just like a menu you would use in a restaurant. A menu gives you options to choose from to build your meal. There's enough detail in the menu for you to decide which dishes are the right fit for you. And similar to a menu, it's broken down under headings. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I'm going to take a quick moment to show you each of the dishes or actions in this menu is laid out. So shown here is the first action that appears under park and public space management, tree planting and greening. And you'll note as you explore it that every single action is laid out in the same way. It starts out with a really brief description, followed by some strategies for implementation, co-benefits, and finally some considerations around maximizing the impact. And it wraps up with climate hazards addressed. Could I have the next slide, please? And as you'll see, if you look at any of the other actions, this one falls under water management, that the structure is laid out in the same way for every single action. It's a quick snapshot of the different actions that are available to a community. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, actually, could we go back one slide? Thank you. And so as you expand and collapse each section of the menu, you will realize that you can very quickly, or relatively quickly, get a big picture sense of what the entire menu is composed of. And it gives you a bird's eye view of the wide breadth of actions available. It is a really great resource for when you're taking those early first decisions, those first steps around project identification. It can also support cross-departmental conversations. And for those who might be exploring RG-Emma funding opportunities, and Emma, I'll cue you to post the link to our funding opportunities in the chat. Many of the projects that are listed here are also eligible for adaptation funding under our adaptation offer. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can explore that link in the chat at a later time. So with that, we can now go on to the next slide. And the next slide is, in fact, prompting us to start our panel discussion. So I'm going to invite Emma and Mo to stop screen sharing so that we can see everyone's lovely face. And I can see everyone. And I'm going to kick off by passing the floor to Sean to answer the following question. As you and your team begin to develop the City of Morton's Community Climate Action Plan, are there any challenges you anticipate in creating a plan that is actionable? And are there conversations your teams are having to prepare for those challenges?
Okay, thanks, Bo. Yeah, and just to put things in context in terms of where the City of Morton is at in the planning process, we are in the process of creating a climate adaptation plan. And the stage that we're at currently is we're sort of going through the risk assessment and completed the majority of the engagement process. And now we're looking forward to putting together some impact statements and then finalizing the plan, hopefully sometimes in the spring of 2026. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is my experience sort of through that process and some of the challenges that I guess I would anticipate coming out of the developing of this plan in terms of creating an actionable plan. So there's maybe three things that I would touch on. One is the extreme weather events that we've experienced in our community, and the multitude of those events. And so that being flood, drought, and extreme heat. And then looking to the plan to prioritize where we should implement some of those action items. And so just to put things in context, the City of Morton experienced a drought where we were 15 feet below spillway and only 3 feet above our water intake. And then 6 months later, we had so much water going over our spillway, there were two culvert bridges that were blown out in town. And so knowing that we've experienced these extreme events, and knowing that we want to implement adaptation measures, It's now figuring out the priority in terms of where we want to focus our efforts. And it seems like the focus right now is going to be very broad on a multitude of different levels. So that is, to me, challenging. Um, the second one, I would say, being from a small municipality, we have about 10,000 people in Morden, would be the staff dedication. That is definitely can be a challenge. So I fortunately have been granted some time to work on the adaptation plan and support the consultant and some of the engagement processes, but it's definitely not a full-time dedication on my part. So there is that element of working side of desk and trying to, keep moving forward in that planning process. And then once the plan is completed, picking up on those implementation projects and applying for implementation funding and seeing that through. So definitely something that can be a challenge, especially for a small group. And then the third one that I would want to identify is just the interdepartmental communication. There's definitely a focus on, larger capital projects and having that infrastructure in place for our community members, and then being able to interject in that planning process of capital projects for infrastructure, for example, and have the ability to put a climate lens on it during the planning process so that we can realize some benefits in the outcomes, or maybe even help direct what we may do with those infrastructure plans. Maybe there's an option for introducing green infrastructure, say in the stormwater project. So it's being able to get in at the very beginning, have that open communication with all of our staff in all departments so that we can bring that climate lens to those projects. Um, and lastly, the question of the conversations that we may be having to prepare for some of these challenges. Just drawing from a recent experience, we went through a staff engagement process where our goal was to be as inclusive as possible with all staff, going from frontline administration staff to operation staff to equipment operators, and have as many people in the room during that engagement process as possible. We definitely tried to bring in an element of fun and engage the group, but also provide something that might be meaningful. So when they see the plan in front of them in a draft form, they can know that they had a hand in creating that. So hopefully we can continue those relationships moving forward.
Thank you, Sean. I love hearing about the early and upfront engagement you're doing internally to build up that rapport and readiness for this plan. Uh, if I could pose the next question to Derry, the County of Huron is recently completed your community climate risk assessment, and you've shared that you are excited to use the insights to start prioritizing projects. What are some key elements of your assessment that you will be using to inform that prioritization process?
Yeah, thanks, Bo. I am very excited that we were able to complete a community climate risk assessment. This was the first of its kind for Huron County, so that was a big undertaking. And to get to the prioritization points, one thing I would like to highlight from the process is that we did try to bring in perspectives from experts in and around the community on a variety of topics for the risk assessment, thinking about the economy, culture, obviously the environment is a big one, social services, immigration, emergency preparedness, and even more. So I was lucky to have access to that expertise from others because oftentimes us in the climate realm don't have all the answers, unfortunately. We do rely on others. And this really gave me good confidence in the risk assessment itself, to know that the end results can help us prioritize projects moving forward. So when I look at the risk assessment now, I look first and foremost to the risk scores at the end of the day for each climate impact statement. We considered three different consequence scores as well, so economic, social, and environmental. So I look at the combination of those three as well to know what the risk and consequence is going to be in our community if this were to occur. And we've used that to compare with our corporate risk assessment, which again is a nice place to start in terms of are there high risk scores from both that are aligned. And in Huron County, if anyone is familiar with the area around the Great Lakes, we do get quite the winter weather, and winter hazards, winter travel, emergency preparedness was one of the climate impact statements that was a high risk in both for the community perspective, as it's impacting them and their services, as well as from a county perspective, as we do have emergency services on staff, as well as manage and maintain a lot of the county roads. So the one nice example I'll be able to share is we've already actioned this in a sense of, because that was such a high risk, our public works team has been able to create a web page on the County of Huron's website to showcase both access to county road data in real time, as well as the provincial highways. In rural areas, they're often the path you need to take to get from point A to point B can be across either or, and a lot of residents had a hard time finding out what roads were closed and when, and are they county, are they municipal, are they provincial. So now that we have a one-stop shop for that information, I'm really hopeful that will help improve safety and even emergency management during these winter events.
Thank you, Derry. It is exciting to hear that you're already taking steps to implement the plan and meeting a need that's been identified in the community. I am going to now pose a question to Rachel. Rachel, the Clean Foundation is supporting several East Coast municipalities moving from planning to implementation projects. Are there any key factors that have been most instrumental in helping a municipality to prioritize which projects to move forward after completing a plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just for a bit of context for those that maybe don't know the Clean Foundation, we work primarily on the east coast of Canada. So, I'm located in Nova Scotia, and we have a program right now, the Community Climate Capacity Program, funded by the provincial government, Environment and Climate Change. And we're supporting about 25 municipalities across the province through capacity. So, we have staff that are dedicated to these communities to help them with their climate work. And for the most part, in our first year and a half, it's been concentrated on adaptation. So with the announcement of all of the local leadership for climate adaptation funding, first with adaptation in action for feasibility studies, and then also implementation projects. And then, of course, there's been climate ready plans and processes. But we've had a couple communities that have been successful in acquiring funding through FCM, so GMF, in that adaptation and action. And I think for them, thinking of a couple like the town of Annapolis Royal, which has under 500 people, and also the town of Pictou, which has a couple thousand. So we're talking small communities. For them, I think what's been really key to go from the plan to implementation has been first and foremost funding. So the availability of those grant dollars has allowed them to get, as we love to say, shovels in the ground. Yes, I love the shout out, go down and Pictou. Yeah, so that has allowed us to be able to do that work. But of course, there was a lot of planning that went into it. And as we know, our municipalities have so many competing priorities. And $1 million, which is the max in adaptation in action, is also not often enough. So the funding landscape does certainly dictate how we're able to implement. And I know that adaptation and action's looking at, that kind of size of project. But when it comes to convincing your council, getting staff on board, having all the pieces of the puzzle line up perfectly, I think another key piece is maximizing co-benefits. And I will probably say co-benefits at least 15 times, I think, over the course of this webinar. It's very important. When we can connect our community risk and community factors, when we connect that with our vulnerability, I think we're able to look at things much more holistically. We're not just saying, it's getting hotter, town of Pictou, the sea level is rising. We know that there are infrastructure risks. It's also, what are they trying to do with their waterfront redevelopment plan and wanting to extend a very popular trail, the Jitney Trail. Shout out Town of Pictou again. If anyone's looking for a nice summer destination for your vacation list, they have this lovely trail, connects with a number of other municipalities, so you can make a real roadshow out of it. But by studying some of the impacts of a living shoreline, we can make that trail more attractive for folks. And then on the adaptation and action side, looking at what was needed along the waterfront to ensure that it is more resilient and that we're factoring in projections for sea level rise. So what are those co-benefits? How is it going to support the economy, those local businesses? How is it going to make things more accessible for residents in the town of Pictou, obviously tourists as well, as I've sort of alluded to. So I think that clear prioritization that looks at what the community needs beyond just the lens of climate change makes it a lot easier for councils to say, okay, we will provide a percentage of funding. And then again, that's where that funding layer comes in too. It's always easier to say yes when you have $1 million to kickstart something. So I think that those are two really key pieces. And I think as well, projects can feel enormous, but it takes time to get to the stage where everything does line up. And I don't think that there's any shame in thinking something's too small. So one component, breaking something off and saying, okay, let's get the engineering drawings for this part of the project, or let's replace this culvert this year. That's moving the needle forward, and I think being a bit more location specific and not getting overwhelmed in the thought of how do I make my whole municipality more resilient is also helpful to again make some of that incremental progress and keep your staff and yourself kind of inspired as you move along this road and not get discouraged by what always feels like an uphill battle. And I think, you stop at one point for us a year and a half into our big project and you look back at those successes and they felt pretty small at the time, but they add up for sure. And that's how we get further ahead. So that's what I would say for now, Bo.
Thank you. That's a very inspiring message from some very small communities making incremental progress. I see a couple of questions coming up in the chat. The first one, I believe, is for Sean. What questions did you, I'm not sure actually. What questions did you ask the community during engagement? Was engagement completed in phases? Maybe this question's for Derry, or maybe because Sean, your engagement was interdepartmental, correct? Or did I miss that there was also community engagement?
We did complete a community engagement
Oh, yes.
along with our staff engagement.
So what questions did you ask the community during that engagement? Apologies.
I think we just tried to gauge, if I can recall, I don't have it in front of me, but questions in terms of where their priorities lie. What are some of the topics that are fresh in their mind? What are some of the things that they feel like need addressing in the community? But the interesting part in our community engagement process was sort of this sense of we trust that the municipality is going to do this, and that this is something that maybe me as an individual resident may not have a large influence on. And so, yeah, that was something interesting that came out of the public engagement.
Thank you. I am seeing some additional questions coming into the chat, but I also know that some of those we already plan on covering in additional panel questions that we have. And so I think I am going to actually now transition us back into presentation mode for just a brief bit of time and pass the floor to Eva Jackson. So Emma and Mo, if you could switch over to screen sharing again, and I will encourage participants to choose the English or the French slides to follow along. And I will ask Eva to take it away.
Perfect. I will be following on the English slides, which I'm seeing the French. I don't know if that's intentional. So just to flag that, I'm fine to move through English or French.
Eva, at the top of your screen, you will see
there
two
we
little
go.
buttons.
I see it. I got it. Sorry. The problem lies between the chair and the laptop is what people always tell me. So thank you for that, Bo, and thanks for the invitation. I'll try to keep things brief because I think the conversation is so rich and there's so much to learn from colleagues from the prairies here in Ontario and also Atlantic Canada. But I wanted to spotlight just a couple of resources that we've had the pleasure and the privilege to develop that I really think can help with that. What do I do first? Creating the plan is a huge milestone, and I certainly don't want to diminish that. But in many ways, it's easier. There's a ton of support out there for plan creation and risk assessment, and the implementation is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. And I think we really want to make sure that we're supporting communities of all sizes in that difficult task. So the first tool I'll spotlight, and I'll ask someone to advance the slide for me here, is around climate insight. And climate insight is, just wondering if someone could move the slide for, thank you. Climate Insight is a online platform available at climateinsight.ca that is created by ICLEI Canada and funded in part by the Government of Canada through Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada. And really, it exists to give users access to resources that help prioritize. And those resources are heavily curated and are meant to give recommendations on the right solution or the right tool or the right case study for you to support the specific thing you would like to do. So I'll dive a little bit into each of these features, as well as some of the new functionality that we've launched. Next slide, please. So the first one is our geospatial map. The map is available with a variety of data sets on it that are sorted at the dissemination area scale. For those of you not familiar with Statistics Canada's codings, dissemination area is smaller than a census subdivision, which is the common data layer used, and larger than 4-digit postal code. There is just over 50,000 dissemination areas in Canada, so that gives you a sense of the scale. And on the map, what we try to do is give access to data sets that can be layered. So in the image you're seeing here, I believe Ottawa is what I had selected as the location. And I've stacked days with maximum temperature above 30 degrees with an infrastructure layer of transit stops and a social vulnerability layer around situational vulnerability, which refers to demographic factors. So age, newcomer status, and all of that is explained in the glossary. And you can start to see, if you are looking to prioritize an action, you could look at stacking these data sets and start to think about, all right, if we're creating more public transit stops because we're creating transit-oriented communities or developments for housing, let's say, you could see that in these darker pink, darker red areas, you've got folks who are experiencing situational vulnerability. They're in an area that's projected to have a high number of days above 30 degrees, and there's some transit stops. You can start to design solutions that take that into account. We should have benches at these transit stops. We should have water fountains. We should have shade structures, perhaps some green infrastructure. I heard somebody mention hoping that their plan will help them to prioritize green infrastructure. This is a tool that can be used to help you cite those solutions in the areas where they can have the most impact, where the co-benefits, Rachel, I heard you loud and clear, where those co-benefits can be maximized, where you're providing better quality of life at the same time solving a climate problem. Next slide, please. If you're looking to identify some of the specific solutions to address climate change, on the next slide, you'll see our solutions finder, which through answering a series of questions, a user can be guided through, just waiting for that slide to advance. Someone doesn't mind? Thank you. What you can do is you can answer a series of questions that goes through the database of about 400 adaptation and mitigation solutions to get to solutions that are recommended for your context. So you can, these are the early questions, giving a sense of the type of community that you're using the site from. You can answer questions about, are you looking to do an adaptation intervention at a single site? So one rec facility, one bioswale, one right of way, or are you looking to address a series of assets? And what the system's doing in the back end is it's taking the solutions that are in there, filtering out the ones that you're not going to be interested in because they don't meet your criteria, and giving you a ranked list of, these are some of the options you should be pursuing first. On the next slide, you can get access to all of that same information through the library. The difference will be in the library, it's not curated for you. It's just giving you everything that's been tagged to, let's say, a wastewater system and adaptation and flooding, for example. So it will give you resources that meet that criteria, but it's not going to order those in anything other than the date that they were added. So library can be fast. The solutions finder is more effective and has more curation. On the next slide are some pieces that I'm particularly excited about because these represent our newest features. And I've only got about 6 minutes left, so this is going to be a whirlwind tour, but I invite you to reach out if you want to speak more about these. So the first one are climate hazard maps. That's just on the next slide. This is a prototype feature that for the first time publicly available is the information about the likelihood of a climate hazard. So for those of you in this space, risk is a function of likelihood and consequence. Well, the likelihood is often the hard part. And in the past, it has been done by perception, backed by some future climate science. What we've done is we've worked with modelers and climate scientists to build models and train them to run past historic data, publicly available mapping, as well as future climate science to assign a likelihood score. These are available for all DAs in the country against the 4 hazards that are listed on the screen, and full methodological documents about how they've been done are available online. So to Derry's earlier point, this is a way to prioritize. You can think about which hazards have the greatest likelihood now, mid-century, and end of century. On the next slide, we've taken that one step further and have designed a high-level climate risk assessment for localized projects or assets. So this is really meant to be for a user over 6 to 8 hours, not 68, 6-8 hours, to be able to do a risk assessment on a specific asset or suite of assets. Those are listed on the screen. The key piece is here, it pulls in that likelihood data and leaves the user to reflect on what they can reflect on, which is the state of the asset already. How is it already impacted by weather? I saw in the chat earlier, someone had asked a question that, a lot of information on climate change has been highly politicized, and there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of rhetoric in this space. And, how do we combat that? And I think one of the pieces really is local knowledge. We know that this culvert fails because it gets blocked up. Perhaps it's not right-sized. We know that this roadway washes out. That is an indisputable fact. That roadway already washes out. The fact that we are giving you a likelihood score of how likely that flooding is in the future takes out the rhetoric and just leaves you to reflect on what you know about best, which is the state of infrastructure in your community. And I think that's one way we can combat some of that rhetoric. When we just speak in plain terms that are non-arguable with, it's just the way that infrastructure acts. On the next slide is the last piece. I'll talk about climate insight, and I'll just spend another minute or two on another tool. And these are energy poverty maps. This is information that we partnered with Efficiency Canada to complete a very targeted and specific request to Statistics Canada to create this energy poverty layer that puts a rating of 1 to 5 and a percentage score on the rate of energy poverty in a given dissemination area. This is a really important piece to understand as we layer it with heat. Oftentimes we speak about access to air conditioning as a way to adapt. One of the challenges is if it's in an area that's already experiencing high levels of energy poverty, it's actually maladaptive. You can give someone an air conditioner, but if they can't afford to run it, it is not going to achieve the adaptation outcome that it is intended to achieve. And so understanding rates of energy poverty are really important as we design solutions, not only for mitigation, but also for adaptation. So I wanted to flag this. The last tool that I'll very quickly talk about, and Bo, I know I'm a minute over, is our Getting Ready to Finance toolkit, and specifically the project ideation guide. So on the next slide, over 2 slides, I'll show you what the project ideation guide does. Is it's a combination of a Word file and an Excel file that we looked at all the funding applications that existed, well, as many as we could, over the course of 2024 and early 2025. And we took all the questions that are common to them and listed out how can a user prepare their applications for those funds by understanding early the questions that are going to be asked and building that into their application. And one of the things on the next slide, you can see that we really wanted to do was create this prioritization framework. So this is an Excel file. You can go online. I'll put the link in the chat as soon as I'm done yapping here. And you can download this Excel file, enter in a long list of projects, ones that might be in your adaptation plan, and score them on this rubric. The rubric looks at things about, how feasible they are, what's the political appetite for this project, are there existing priorities that this project leverages, and it enables a user to assign a score to each criteria and then have a final score. It's not a be-all and end-all solution, but it's one way to go from a long list to a shorter list with numerical ranking. These types of tools are best done, thank you, Emma. These types of tools are best done in conjunction with the other departments that would be responsible for implementation. And I think that serves 2 benefits. The first one being you get better answers and better scores. But the other one is it really builds buy-in for implementing that project. When people feel that they somehow have a say in how the action is implemented, how it's designed, what it leverages, the benefits it can achieve, how can it be tweaked to achieve other benefits, they're more likely to push forward on that implementation. On the next slide, there's a download link there. You can access all of the Getting Ready to Finance toolkit. It's all available freely online in English and in French, as is Climate Insight. I should mention that. The full site is available in both English and French. And with that, I'll ask Emma and Mo to advance to our final slide just to say thank you to Bo and the other panelists for letting me interrupt your wonderful conversation with just a couple of the tools that we have that can support prioritization in that challenging, just get it done phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. I'm seeing so much appreciation, applause, hearts flying through the screen. I also saw them when you were highlighting, well, throughout, but in particular when you were highlighting the project ideation guide. And one quick question about that guide. Before diving into it, at what point does a community need to be? What pre-work do they need to have done at that point?
Really, the idea is that I think a community needs to understand the local risks. Does that mean they have to have gone through a comprehensive risk assessment process? No. There needs to be some understanding of the risks that the community is facing. Obviously, the more rigorous that process of understanding risk is, the more buy-in there is locally to take action. But the project ideation guide is really just meant to get people to a long list of actions they'd like to take. It's a series of questions to get to that. The prioritization takes that long list, 20 to 30 ideas, and takes it down to a shorter list based on a priority scale. That resource was specifically designed to try to get projects funded. So you'll see when you click into it, it really has a bend around finding funding, finding financing, and less around designing the actions themselves. We see that really more as an ICLEI speak milestone 3 of our Building Adaptive Resilient Communities program, designing the plan. And you heard Sean speak about that. You heard Derry speak about like the consultation process to get to those actions. The getting ready to finance is really that space between the plan and implementation where you're like, how the heck am I going to get the money to do this? Obviously, GMF is a great resource for municipalities on implementation through the capital funding, but there are other provincial resources, regional resources, and increasingly philanthropic resources available to municipalities.
Thank you again, Eva. All right. Well, that leads us very nicely into a continuation of our panel discussion. All right. So I am seeing questions come into the chat. I hope you continue to add them there. We are going to start with a question that kind of continues our conversation around project prioritization and key inputs and thinking about how climate adaptation can really feed into that. So Sean and anyone else, what from the City of Moreton's perspective, what are key inputs that are going to feed in and how you are prioritizing projects? Eva talked a lot about it, but I'm also wondering, among those key inputs, which are you anticipating to be most challenging to assess?
Yeah, and I had, looked at this question and prepared an answer, and then Eva proposed this toolkit, and I think I want to change my answer to I'm just going to use the toolkit for priorities. Everything that I'm thinking about in terms of how you assess and what are the inputs into priorities are all covered in that toolkit. So that's a fantastic resource. So, but in preparing and answering the question, we talked about risk ratings, and you're going to, come out with your risk ratings. You're going to use your local knowledge for input into those. I definitely agree with the challenges of predicting or inputting likelihood. So if there's a methodology to do that, even better, because that's definitely something that in our staff engagement, we avoided talking about likelihood just because it would have, muddied the waters too much and got us in the weeds. So that tool is something that I would lean on as well. But you have this risk rating, and I don't think your priority falls alone on just the high, very high risk ratings. And there's other factors that I would consider to be involved in prioritizing those projects. Obviously, it's going to be the cost of the capital project. And you talked about that as well, and the funding and grants that are available for that, which then again are linked to the priorities of council. So definitely all of those three combined are going to influence how you prioritize your project. And again, I think it's the involvement or even sometimes the motivation of staff. So is there someone that's going to push the project forward because it's something that is of keen interest of theirs? It's not just something that they're forced to do, but it's something that they want to do and they see the value in that project. So I think that also would change in terms of how you prioritize that and placing that sort of climate lens. So yeah, I would say that it's a combination of all of those, and it does come back to a local context. So the way we prioritize our projects in our community might be different based on what you're experiencing locally and some of your local knowledge, and your funding, where you're at with council, and where you're at with other capital projects, sort of in your financial plan. But again, I get back to how can we sort of put a climate lens, so to speak, on the majority of our projects. How can we link them together, and how can we have those co-benefits? So this has all been fantastic discussion. I've learned a lot, and it's made me sort of think about how we're going to proceed moving forward in our climate adaptation plan process and seek funding for implementation.
Thank you, Sean. It's the reason we have the resource spotlights. Everybody gets to learn, including our panelists.
Absolutely.
And just gonna note that your comments about having a project champion really resonated. It's having someone who's going to keep it driving forwards can just make such a big difference. So one question that came in to the Q&A box was around challenges for smaller municipalities. And this aligns really well with a question that I'm going to start off with asking Derry, but anyone else is also welcome to add. Derry, what barriers are smaller municipalities more likely to encounter when prioritizing which adaptation projects to move forwards? And do you have any advice on tackling these challenges and barriers?
Yeah, Bo, that's a great question. And I think climate practitioners everywhere never have a short list of barriers. There's always lots to pick from. I'd say maybe one that may hit harder for smaller municipalities could be a lack of time and even the project ideation guide that Eva mentioned, I'm also thinking will now help with this. But it's a lack of time around preparing the funding applications and even knowing that they're available. If you're not in the right circles or following the right resources or accounts, it can be very tricky to know when they come up. And a lot of them have a tight turnaround to begin with. And in small municipalities, we're generally doing this work on the side of our desk. So it's not the only project on the go. So it's hard then to drop other priorities as well. And I think something that has really helped me in this area is if you do know what projects you want to prioritize, following those funding sources that you're aware of or reaching out to contacts that can share them with you can be really beneficial. So to speak, as in letting other staff know, or even other organizations or other professionals say, hey, we really want to do a climate risk assessment of our buildings. I would love if you could share any possible funding with me that you hear of. That can maybe be one opportunity. Yeah, there's lots of other barriers, but maybe I'll see if others want to share.
Eva, I think Eva has something to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Derry, that that's exactly the reason what you're summing up why we created that project ideation guide, so that as those ideas come up, you can start completing parts of those applications. So when the funding call does come out, you're not starting at 0, you might be 40%. And you might have to tweak things a little bit to say, okay, this is what GMF wants to know, but this is what the government of Ontario might want to know, and this is, what somebody else might want to know. I think the other barrier, particularly for small communities, and here I am speaking on your behalf, I apologize, is the return on investment. Everybody and their sister applies for these funds. So if you're going to take that tiny little bit of side of desk energy you have, are you going to put it in for the fund that it's 600 applicants and you've got a 1 in 600 chance? So I think there's ways of overcoming that barrier. I think Rachel and some of the communities, particularly in Nova Scotia, but likely elsewhere in Atlantic Canada, like working regionally. Where can you apply as a region to say, you know what, it doesn't make sense for County of Huron and Grey Bruce and the City of Kincardine and whomever to do this separately. Let's put in a bigger ask, pool our resources in the application process, have one person administer it, but then work regionally to overcome that. Is it worth it? Because suddenly you're more attractive to a funder, right? You're a bigger pool, bigger funds can become available. So I think there's ways to overcome it, but it really is like the competitiveness of pitting high need municipalities. You're all high need municipalities on adaptation against each other is a really counterintuitive way to advance adaptation. I wish I could wave my magic wand and be like, that's not how funders are going to work, but we'll have to keep working on Bo on that one. So, but just to say, like, I think, Rachel, maybe you can reflect on the regional work that's happened in Nova Scotia, but I think that's one piece really worth exploring. Like, let's not work as 4,500 individual municipalities, but in these groupings.
Yeah, I can chime in there. I know that sometimes we don't get along with our neighbors, but I think sometimes we can just ignore that because I often find, not that I'm the youngest person in the room, but it tends to be on the older side because they've had more years to argue, I suppose. But I think that, you can have those conversations. You can start building those relationships with your neighbors as, a new staff person or even a long-standing staff person to talk to the next community over. And if you can't do that, it doesn't mean you can't work with somebody who's even a few 100 kilometers away, still sort of sharing similar vulnerabilities and risks. Because, yes, absolutely, funders. And I mean, FCM is looking for this, it seems, on all of their LLCA applications, looking for that collaboration. And it does make it a lot easier to pool those resources, talk to each other. You're then a little less lonely in navigating this space as well. And I do think it makes a big difference. And I promise FCM didn't tell me to say this, but I would say as a funder, GMF, they keep you in the loop a lot better than other funds, which I find is helpful. So when we're looking at, which funding pot makes the most sense, they're all open at the same time, they're all due within the next week. I find that GMF will let you know a month or two later what you're missing, what might make the application better. Perhaps they'll tell you to partner with the neighboring community. And there's other funding streams that, you go 6, 8, 10 months without hearing anything, and you're trying to figure out whether to start, whether to, reimagine a project, whatever it might be. And then you find out it's a yes or you find out it's a no. And again, you're scrambling. So that's a nice nod to FCM and GMF there on that one.
Thank you for that nod, Rachel. You took the words out of my mouth. That is what we strive for. Um, I'm hearing a lot around time being a challenge, but also that putting the time into setting up those regional relationships, establishing them so they're in place and ready to go, and maybe also setting up the time to have those systems in place, like Derry was talking about, to monitor for funding opportunities and systems like Eva was describing, to be able to make the application process less overwhelming.
Can I add, Bo, something
Oh,
to that
please do,
conversation?
yes.
Yeah. And again, just from our perspective, building on this conversation is the idea of having a project put forward in your capital budget that you're applying for funding for. Sometimes that is contingent on the success of getting that funding. And so sometimes our small municipalities, we don't outline that we want to fund the project in its entirety and then apply for a grant. And if we are successful with the grant, then it reduces our cost. But either way, the project is going to move forward. So what we found is that we have to be careful to not put forward a project with a large financial portion of that project anticipated from possible funding. Because if we don't get the funding, then the project dies. So that definitely is a challenge to get that commitment up front early on this time of year to fund an entire project without knowing that we may or may not. Well, sure, we're going to apply for 3 different funding streams for this project, but we might not get any of them. So there's that. And then the other one is what Rachel said, is that stall or delay in funding. And not to throw anyone under the bus, but we did have a project where we waited 2.5 years to hear back from a funding agency on whether, so that stalled the project because we didn't want to apply for other funding while we were waiting to hear back in case we were successful. So that also tied the project up. At the end, the answer was no. And so now we're 2.5 years later saying, okay, we want this project to go forward. What do we apply for next? How do we make this happen? And ultimately, that's the decision of council to fund the project in its entirety with the hope that we can then find resources after the fact.
Thank you, Sean. those are challenges, and I'm sorry to hear you're working on troubleshooting now, but you are very innovative, and so I think that it's helpful to share those challenges openly like this. Appreciate it. I am seeing the time, and so I am going to ask Emma and Mo to screen share once again so that we can share a few final takeaways. So if you are looking to connect with FCM or GMF, there are QR codes on the screen, and you are welcome to scan those and to reach out. I will note just briefly that some of the questions that were posted in the chat now have written responses. Thank you very much to our panelists who were able to sneak in some written responses. So I encourage you to take a look at the Q&A.
Thanks for the invitation, Bo. Nice to meet you, Sean, Derry. Always great to see you, Rachel.
Yes,
Thank
see you
you,
soon.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
both.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Thank
Emma.
Bo.
you.